Welcome to my channel. Tonight, we journey into one of the most haunting tales in aviation history, a story of hope, exhaustion, and silence above the dark skies of New York. This is the true story of Avianca Flight 052, the flight that left a trail of heartbreak, confusion, and questions that still echo through the corridors of every control tower today. What began as a routine overnight journey from Bogota to New York would end in a desperate struggle against time, fuel, and fate. The passengers on board believed they were minutes from landing, unaware that every passing second was bringing them closer to disaster. And when the engines finally fell silent, the night sky itself seemed to hold its breath. It was January 25, 1990. The Boeing 707 belonging to Avianca Airlines sliced through the night above the Caribbean Sea, its four engines roaring steadily. On board were 158 people, families, students, business travelers, and crew, all eager to reach New York before dawn. The cabin lights glowed softly as flight attendants served coffee and meals, laughter echoing faintly over the hum of engines. Up front, Captain Laureano Cavides, an experienced pilot with years of long-haul flights behind him, adjusted the controls with calm precision. Beside him sat First Officer Mauricio Klotz, younger, sharp, and alert despite the long flight hours. In the jump seat sat Flight Engineer Hernando Lotero, methodically monitoring gauges. They had faced storms before, delays before, but tonight would test something far greater than skill. The flight had already endured setbacks. Departing from Bogota, they had made a brief stop in Medellin to pick up additional passengers, delaying their schedule. Then came strong headwinds along the route, winds that quietly ate away at their fuel reserve. None of this was unusual. Fuel management was routine in aviation. Yet this night, fate played a cruel game. As the aircraft approached the northeastern United States, heavy weather blanketed the region. John F. Kennedy International Airport, their destination, was congested with dozens of planes circling in holding patterns, each awaiting permission to land. Controllers' voices filled the radio with a constant stream of instructions, each aircraft jockeying for priority. Inside Flight 052's cockpit, the pilots adjusted their course, waiting patiently for their turn. But patience, in aviation, is measured in fuel, and theirs was running dangerously low. The passengers could feel the turbulence now, the plane banking slowly in wide circles over the ocean, lightning flashing in the distance. Most assumed it was routine. They didn't know that for over an hour, the aircraft had been holding in pattern, its engines burning through the last of its reserve. Captain Cavides radioed the controllers, his voice calm but tight. "Kennedy, Avianca 052, we're running low on fuel." The controller acknowledged but gave no special clearance. The word emergency was never spoken. That single omission would soon become the most tragic silence in the history of this flight. Down below, air traffic control struggled with stormy weather and congested runways, unaware that the plane above them was nearing its final drops of fuel. As they circled for the third time, the cockpit grew tense. The flight engineer leaned forward, scanning his dials. "Captain, we are very low now," he said quietly. Cavides nodded, his brow furrowed. "Tell them again," he ordered. The first officer keyed the mic. "Kennedy Tower, Avianca 052, we're low on fuel, please give us priority." Once again, the reply came back in a neutral tone. "Roger, Avianca 052, maintain heading and expect vectors shortly." They waited. No vectors came. The minutes stretched thin. Each turn of the aircraft felt heavier, slower. The fuel gauges continued their silent descent toward empty. The passengers began to notice the flicker of lights dimming in the cabin as systems adjusted to conserve power. A mother whispered a prayer. A businessman looked out into the black void beyond his window, unaware he was staring into the last view he would ever see. Finally, permission came to approach JFK. Relief washed through the cockpit, but it was short-lived. The storm had shifted, and the crosswinds over the runway made a safe landing impossible. They were ordered to circle again, to hold for just a few more minutes. "We can't hold," the captain muttered. The engines sputtered slightly, a warning that went unheard by anyone but the men inside that cockpit. They diverted toward their alternate, Newark Airport. The decision was desperate, the fuel nearly gone. The cabin lights flickered again, the engines straining. The flight attendants moved quietly through the aisle, tightening seatbelts, hiding their fear behind practiced smiles. Over the radio, the controller's voice was calm, unaware of the catastrophe building in the dark. Avianca 052, descend to 2,000 feet. The first officer's reply came slow, weary. 2,000, we're running out of fuel, sir. Still, the word emergency never came. At 9:30 p.m., as the aircraft descended through thick clouds, the engines began to cough. It was faint at first, a small, uneven sputter that every pilot dreads. The fuel tanks were dry. The right engine flamed out, its roar fading into an eerie hum. "We lost number 4, the engineer shouted. "Switching crossfeed." The captain's hands moved instinctively, his voice calm but urgent. "Try to restart." The left engine sputtered next, the cockpit lights dimming. Alarms blared. The first officer radioed again, desperation breaking through his voice. "Kennedy, we're losing engines, we need priority landing now." But in the control tower, the phrase sounded routine, another pilot requesting assistance in bad weather. They didn't know he meant it literally. The third engine failed. Then the fourth. The silence that followed was unlike anything anyone had ever heard before, a massive jet, falling through darkness, powered only by gravity. Inside the cabin, people began to pray. Some clutched their loved ones, others whispered names of children waiting at home. The captain fought the yoke, trying to glide the aircraft toward the faint lights below. "Where's the runway?" he shouted. "I can't see it." The first officer's breathing was loud, panicked. "We're too low. We're too low." The altimeter spun downward. Outside, the fog broke for a moment, revealing a cluster of suburban lights in Cove Neck, Long Island. The plane skimmed just above the treetops. The captain's final words were almost a whisper. "Flaps full, the gear down, hold on." Seconds later, the Boeing 707 struck a hillside, its fuselage splitting apart on impact. A fireball lit the sky for miles. The screams, the tearing metal, and then silence. The aftermath was chaos, rescue teams battling cold, darkness, and confusion. Out of the 158 souls on board, 73 survived, many pulled from the wreckage by local residents who braved flames and debris. But for the families who waited in New York that night, hope turned to horror as the morning news broke. Avianca Flight 052 has crashed on approach. Investigators arrived within hours, stepping into a scene that told a story both simple and devastating. The aircraft was largely intact, its engines unburned. That could mean only one thing: it hadn't crashed from impact or fire. It had fallen silently, out of fuel. In the months that followed, the investigation uncovered the truth: miscommunication. A gap between cultures, between languages, between definitions of urgency. The Avianca crew had repeatedly told air traffic control they were low on fuel, but never declared an emergency. In U.S. aviation language, low fuel was advisory. Fuel emergency was a plea for survival. The words had been lost in translation. That night, two worlds had spoken the same language but not the same meaning, and 85 lives paid the price. Investigators replayed the cockpit voice recordings over and over, listening to the growing fear in the pilots' voices as the situation deteriorated. At one point, the first officer whispered, "Tell them we can't wait." The captain replied, "They know." But they didn't. The communication gap that had once been small enough to overlook now stood wide enough to swallow an airplane whole. In the final report, the cause of the crash was listed as fuel exhaustion due to failure to declare an emergency and inadequate crew coordination. But buried beneath the technical terms was something far more human: exhaustion, assumption, and the quiet tragedy of not being heard. The legacy of Flight 052 reshaped aviation forever. New international communication standards were created, ensuring that no matter where a pilot came from, the words "fuel emergency" would mean the same thing to every controller on Earth. Training programs emphasized assertive communication and cultural awareness in the cockpit. The changes saved lives, hundreds, perhaps thousands in the years to come. Yet for the families of those lost, the reforms were cold comfort. They would never see their loved ones again. And so, the story of Avianca Flight 052 became more than just an accident report. It became a reminder of the fragility of life and the cost of silence. It taught the world that sometimes tragedy isn't born from chaos, but from quiet moments when help could have come, if only someone had truly listened. If you found this story as moving as I did, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel for more real-life air disaster stories that explore the courage, lessons, and humanity behind the tragedies that changed aviation forever. Thank you for watching, and may every flight remind us that communication, above all else, saves lives. The investigation into Avianca Flight 052 began before the fires had even stopped smoldering. Long Island's quiet neighborhoods, used to the sound of the sea and wind, now echoed with the hum of helicopters, sirens, and the murmurs of investigators who knew they were standing in the middle of a story that would haunt aviation forever. Pieces of the Boeing 707 lay scattered across the cold, damp hills of Cove Neck, sections of the fuselage torn open like pages of a book that no one wanted to read. The scent of burned kerosene hung heavy in the air, mixed with smoke and rain-soaked earth. It was in this wreckage, among broken seats and twisted metal, that investigators began to unravel how a plane with no major mechanical failure, no mid-air explosion, and no enemy interference could fall silently from the sky. The first clues came from the engines. Each one, still largely intact, showed no sign of internal damage or fire. That was unusual. Most crashes ended with engines disintegrating or burning beyond recognition. When investigators opened them, they found something that made their stomachs drop. They were clean. Not burned, not exploded, just empty. No traces of fuel. No signs of combustion. For a moment, the field team thought it might have been a fuel leak, but when they examined the tanks, they were sealed perfectly. It became clear what had happened before the crash. The engines hadn't failed because of a mechanical fault. They had stopped because they had nothing left to burn. Inside the shattered cockpit, the voice recorder was recovered, blackened but intact. When it was flown to Washington for analysis, a roomful of experts gathered in silence to listen to the final 45 minutes of the flight. At first, the voices were calm, procedural, the kind of tone every pilot is trained to maintain. But as the minutes ticked by, those voices began to change. The tension crept in gradually, a hesitation here, a sigh there, a subtle edge of disbelief when the first officer said softly, "We're really low now." The captain's voice remained calm, almost too calm. "They'll clear us soon," he said. Then came a call to air traffic control. "Kennedy, Avianca 052, we're running low on fuel." The reply was routine. "Roger, Avianca 052, expect vectors." The investigators leaned forward. Expect vectors. It meant wait. The pilots were waiting, trusting the system. The system, however, did not understand the danger. As the recording continued, the conversation became faster, more desperate. The first officer said again, "Tell them we cannot hold." The captain's voice was strained now. "Keep calling." The radio crackled with static as controllers juggled dozens of aircraft trying to land at Kennedy amid rough weather. In the background of the recording, the unmistakable warning chime of low fuel could be heard. It grew louder, insistent, ignored only because there was no choice. The investigators sat in silence, knowing what came next. Then came the sound that no one ever forgets, a long, hollow humph as one of the engines flamed out. "We lost number 4, the engineer shouted. The captain didn't hesitate. "Try crossfeed. Restart it." The first officer radioed again. "Kennedy, we're running out of fuel." The controller's voice came back, steady and unaware. Roger, Avianca 052, turn left heading 060. The captain muttered something in Spanish, a quiet curse of disbelief. The plane was dying in the air, and no one below knew it. The recording went on, one by one, the engines stopped. We've lost two, now one, the engineer's voice broke, and then the tape filled with the rush of wind as the cockpit alarms screamed. The final words were barely audible. We're out of fuel, the first officer said. We're losing power. Then a final cry. Flaps full, hold on, followed by silence. The analysts stopped the tape. For a long moment, no one spoke. What they had just heard wasn't a case of pilot error or malfunction. It was something more tragic, a simple misunderstanding between people who spoke the same language but not the same code. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Avianca's crew had been trained to use phrasing common in Latin American aviation, where low fuel carried an unspoken urgency understood by regional controllers. But in the U.S., FAA protocol required pilots to use specific words: fuel emergency or Mayday. Without those words, controllers assumed the situation was manageable. The difference between the two systems was small, just a few words, but it had killed 85 people. One investigator later said, "They weren't ignored. They were misunderstood." That single sentence summed up the tragedy better than any technical report could. The cockpit recorder wasn't the only haunting discovery. The flight data recorder showed the plane's exact movements during the last few minutes. Slow descent, minor corrections, and then a sharp drop in altitude as the engines failed in sequence. But what chilled everyone most was how controlled it was. The pilots fought until the very end, gliding a massive jetliner through fog and darkness with no power, no lights, and no guidance. The 707 didn't plummet immediately. It floated, ghost-like, over Long Island, until its wings clipped the trees and gravity took over. The crew had given everything they had to save it. In the days that followed, the media erupted with questions. How could this happen near one of the busiest airports in the world? How could a flight run out of fuel in the age of modern aviation? Headlines screamed, "Out of fuel, out of luck," and "The silence that killed Flight 052. Victims' families gathered in New York, demanding answers, while Avianca Airlines tried to defend its crew. They were not careless, a company spokesman said. They were desperate, and they trusted they were being understood. Behind the scenes, the NTSB and FAA began a race against time to identify every link in the chain of failure, not to assign blame, but to ensure it could never happen again. Interviews with surviving passengers painted a picture of quiet panic in the cabin before the crash. One survivor, a young student named Maria Lopez, described how the lights flickered, then went dark moments before impact. "It felt like the world stopped moving," she said softly. "There was no sound, no engines, just the sound of people praying." Another survivor remembered looking out the window and seeing houses below, so close he could see porch light. "I thought we were landing," he said. Then everything exploded. The NTSB's early findings shocked even the most seasoned expert. The plane had been circling New York for over an hour, receiving one delay after another due to weather and traffic. It had been cleared for approach 3 times, each aborted due to runway conditions. During that time, the crew made over 20 radio calls, requesting priority but never declaring an emergency. On one of the final transmissions, the first officer had said the words that would later echo through courtrooms: "We're running out of fuel, sir." To the untrained ear, that sounded routine. To those who now listened knowing the ending, it was a cry for help. And as the days turned to weeks, that cry began to echo through the entire aviation community. Pilots from around the world began to question their own training. How many times had they said something they thought was clear but wasn't? How many times had fatigue dulled their urgency? The industry had long prided itself on precision, but now it faced an uncomfortable truth. Communication wasn't universal. Words could mean life or death. Even before the final report was published, new guidelines were drafted. Controllers were instructed to question any aircraft that mentioned low fuel, with follow-up confirmation. "Are you declaring an emergency?" Pilots were retrained to use standardized phrasing. No assumptions, no interpretations. Every word would mean exactly what it was supposed to mean. Yet, for the families who stood by the crash site in Cove Neck, laying flowers where the fuselage had burned, the changes came too late. The snow had begun to fall again by the time the last bodies were recovered. The sky above was quiet now, deceptively peaceful, as if it too mourned the voices that had once filled it. When investigators finally concluded the case, one of them wrote in his private notes, "Flight 052 did not die because of one mistake. It died because of 1,000 seconds of misunderstanding." And that, more than anything, would be the lasting legacy of Avianca 052, that in the vastness of the sky, where steel and storm meet human fragility, it's not always the thunder that brings tragedy. Sometimes, it's the silence. As the official hearings into the Avianca Flight 052 disaster began, the atmosphere in the NTSB's Washington headquarters was heavy, like a courtroom haunted by the echoes of hundreds of invisible witnesses. Families filled the back rows, clutching photographs of loved ones lost, their faces pale but determined to hear the truth. On one side sat Avianca's representatives, lawyers, executives, and former pilots, each hiding their tension behind stiff professionalism. On the other sat officials from the FAA and the Port Authority of New York, equally uneasy, knowing that somewhere in this tangled web of communication and fatigue lay their own share of responsibility. At the center stood the investigators, men and women who had spent months combing through wreckage, transcripts, and haunting audio recordings that refused to fade from their minds. The lead investigator, a gray-haired man named Robert Collins, spoke first, his tone calm but deliberate. "This was not a crash caused by weather," he said softly. "This was not caused by machinery. This was caused by words, or rather, the lack of them." The room fell silent. Even the air seemed to hold still, as if listening to the weight of every syllable. They played the cockpit voice recording again, this time for the public record. The room darkened, the hum of the recording equipment filling the space. A voice, calm, professional, came through the speakers. "Kennedy, Avianca 052, we're running low on fuel." Then the controller's monotone response. Then the second warning, sharper, more desperate. The same reply. By the third transmission, the first officer's voice cracked. "We can't hold any more." Then came the sounds everyone dreaded, alarms, confusion, shouting, then a burst of static. The recording stopped. The lights came back on. In the audience, a woman pressed her hands to her face and sobbed quietly. Robert Collins let the silence stretch before continuing. "You've just heard the final 6 minutes of Avianca Flight 052. 6 minutes in which 85 lives could have been saved if one simple phrase had been spoken. Mayday, fuel emergency. But it wasn't. In the following testimony, experts tried to explain what had gone wrong linguistically. Pilots from Latin America had been trained to express urgency indirectly, using politeness and tone, a habit rooted in cultural respect. In many countries, saying Mayday was considered overly dramatic unless engines were already failing. Meanwhile, American controllers were trained to respond to clear, procedural keyword. The tragedy of Flight 052 lay exactly between those two worlds, a space where politeness met protocol and humanity fell through the gap. A Colombian linguist brought in by the board summarized it simply. They asked for help, but not in the language help understands. That phrase stuck with everyone who heard it. But language was only part of the story. Fatigue played its own merciless role. The crew of Flight 052 had been awake for nearly 24 hours by the time the engines flamed out. The stopover in Medellin had stretched longer than planned, and headwinds across the Caribbean had cost them precious minutes. Their approach into New York had been delayed again and again by weather, and each hold added another ring to their exhaustion. A pilot's mind under fatigue is like a camera losing focus. Peripheral details vanish, leaving only fragments of perception. The investigators believed that by the time the flight reached its last holding pattern, the crew's ability to process critical information had been severely impaired. The first officer, in particular, had made several calls to the tower using increasingly vague language. "We need priority landing," he said once and again. "We can't continue." Each time, his voice grew thinner, weaker, as if he were trying to speak through fog. Meanwhile, inside the control tower, the chaos of that night had been unimaginable. Kennedy's controllers had been handling one of the heaviest traffic loads in months. Storms had diverted flights, forced go-arounds, and created an endless line of waiting aircraft. The radar screens glowed red and green, dotted with transponder codes, each one a plane circling in darkness, each one a life depending on a voice. The controller responsible for Avianca 052, a man named Michael Reeves, testified that he had not realized the flight situation until the moment it disappeared from radar. "They said they were low on fuel," he explained quietly, "but that happens all the time. We had at least 6 other aircraft in holding patterns with low reserve. None declared an emergency." The lawyer questioning him leaned forward. "Did you ask if they were declaring one?" Reeves hesitated. "No," he admitted. "It didn't sound that serious. The tone didn't suggest it." His words sparked outrage from the families in the gallery. One man stood up and shouted, "How could it not sound serious when they said they were running out of fuel?" Security moved quickly to calm him, but the emotion in the room had already shifted. The anger, the disbelief, the realization that this wasn't just a technical error. It was human misunderstanding amplified by exhaustion and pressure. Back in Colombia, news of the hearings spread like wildfire. The crew's families defended the pilots fiercely, calling them heroes who had done everything they could. "They died trying to save lives," said the widow of First Officer Klotz, tears streaking her face during a television interview. "He called for help. They just didn't hear him." The Colombian press accused U.S. authorities of arrogance, claiming that American controllers had ignored the foreign crew because of accents and assumptions. Meanwhile, in the United States, newspapers ran headlines blaming Avianca for poor training and mismanagement. "Tragedy of lost words," one headline read. "Pilots fail to declare Mayday." The divide between nations deepened, turning a shared tragedy into a diplomatic shadow. As weeks turned to months, investigators returned to the wreckage site to study the aircraft's instruments and structure in detail. Among the debris, they found something unexpected: a small, handwritten note taped to the flight engineer's clipboard. It was a checklist written in Spanish, translated from an English original. But the translation wasn't perfect. The line that in English read, "Declare fuel emergency if fuel reaches reserve level," had been translated into a phrase meaning roughly, "Advise control when fuel becomes low." A single mistranslation, so small, so ordinary, had quietly rewritten the rules inside that cockpit. It was not malicious, not intentional, just human. But in aviation, the difference between a word and its shadow can mean the difference between landing and falling. As the hearings continued, attention turned to Avianca itself. The airline's executives were grilled about their crew training programs, communication protocols, and maintenance record. They insisted that their pilots were among the best trained in the world, that they had met all international standards. "The failure was in understanding," said one executive, "not in competence." But the FAA disagreed. "Understanding," the lead examiner replied, "is part of competence." That line made front-page news the next morning. Then came the moment that stunned everyone in the room. A surviving passenger, one of the few able to walk again after months of recovery, was invited to testify. Her name was Sofia Alvarez, a college student who had been returning from a family visit in Bogotá. She spoke softly but clearly, her hands trembling as she described the moments before the crash. When the lights went out, people started to cry, she said. The flight attendants told us to stay calm. I remember hearing someone in the back praying loudly. Then I looked out the window and saw trees. She paused, her voice breaking. The captain said something like, "Hold on," and then there was fire. When I woke up, I was in the snow. Her testimony was brief, but her final words silenced the room. I could hear children crying in the dark, and someone kept calling for the pilot. But he never answered. Those words cut deeper than any report could. The hearings closed weeks later, with a final statement from the board. The cause of this accident, it read, was a breakdown in communication between the flight crew and air traffic control, exacerbated by inadequate crew management and fatigue. But beyond the official phrasing, everyone knew what it really meant. Two groups of people, both trying to do their jobs, had failed to understand each other in time. And from that misunderstanding came not just a tragedy, but a lesson written in blood and smoke. Long after the hearings ended, Robert Collins would admit in an interview that this case haunted him more than any other. "It wasn't just a crash," he said quietly. "It was a conversation that died mid-sentence." And somewhere above the Long Island coastline, where the night once swallowed a jet and its final words, the echoes of that conversation still lingered, a reminder that even in the age of machines and protocols, it is still the human voice that keeps us alive in the sky. The years following the Avianca Flight 052 disaster became a quiet storm of reflection and change. Aviation had faced tragedies before, but this one left a scar deeper than most. It wasn't the scale of destruction that haunted the world, it was the simplicity of the mistake. Words. Just words. Two languages sharing the same sky, yet speaking past each other until gravity wrote the final sentence. In the months after the official report, the industry went into a kind of collective soul-searching. Airlines across the globe ordered new training for their crews, emphasizing direct, assertive communication in the cockpit. Controllers were retrained to question, to confirm, to listen for the tone that might mean more than the words themselves. But reforms on paper couldn't erase the images from that cold January night, the shattered fuselage resting among bare trees, the faces of rescuers illuminated by floodlights, the silence that followed after the flames died down. In Bogotá, a small memorial was built in a park near El Dorado Airport. It was simple, just a stone engraved with the names of the victims and a single line beneath, "Las palabras importan." Words matter. Families gathered there each year, leaving flowers, lighting candles, whispering the same question that haunted every parent, every spouse, every friend who had waited for that plane to land. How could something so ordinary go so wrong? In New York, another memorial rose near Cove Neck, a garden of white stones arranged in a spiral, symbolizing the holding pattern that became their prison in the sky. Pilots visiting the memorial often left their badges there, silent tributes to the men who had fought to the end. Meanwhile, the surviving passengers tried to rebuild lives that would never feel whole again. Some carried scars that marked their skin forever. Others bore invisible wounds that woke them in the middle of the night to the phantom sound of engines dying. Sofia Alvarez, the student who had testified before Congress, found herself haunted by survivors' guilt. In interviews, she admitted that every time she heard the hum of an aircraft above, her chest tightened. "I can't stop wondering why I lived," she said once during a documentary. "It should have been someone else. Maybe a mother with children. Maybe the pilot. I didn't do anything to deserve it." Over time, she turned her pain into purpose, studying aviation safety and later becoming one of the first South American consultants on international communication training for flight crews. "If my voice can help them understand each other," she said years later, "then maybe those who died won't have died for nothing." Back in the United States, the FAA faced intense scrutiny. The hearings had exposed not just communication issues but deep cracks in air traffic control infrastructure. The controllers that night had been overworked, managing record traffic in bad weather, with limited radar capacity and high stress. The recordings revealed moments when two conversations overlapped, when instructions had to be repeated, when vital seconds were lost in a storm of static and overlapping frequencies. One retired controller, when interviewed for a documentary, put it bluntly, "We weren't gods. We were people in headsets, trying to keep metal birds from colliding in the dark. But you can't help someone if they don't know the right word for help." It was both an admission and an apology that resonated deeply with the public. Captain Laureano Cavides and his crew became both symbols and scapegoat. For some, they were heroes who had fought fate to the very last breath. For others, they were professionals who had failed to follow procedure. But among pilots, there was a different kind of respect, one that understood the impossible balance between authority and fatigue, between duty and desperation. Avianca pilots, in particular, began carrying small cards inside their flight bags, laminated checklists written in bold red ink that said, "If fuel reaches minimums, declare emergency immediately. No exceptions." It was a small gesture, but to them it was sacred. For years, the accident remained a case study in every major aviation training academy around the world. The phrase, Avianca 052, became shorthand for communication failure in classrooms and simulator exercises. In flight training simulators, instructors would recreate the same weather conditions, same delays, same descent instructions, and then stop the scenario halfway through to ask their students, "What would you say now?" Some hesitated. Others declared Mayday. And every time a young pilot said it too late, they understood the weight of hesitation. "This is what killed them," instructors would whisper. "Don't ever wait to be understood." The crash also sparked deep changes in cockpit culture. Before Avianca 052, there was a strict hierarchy inside many cockpits, especially in non-Western airlines. The captain's word was law, and questioning it could be seen as disrespect. Junior officers often hesitated to contradict senior pilots, even in emergencies. But after the tragedy, a new philosophy, crew resource management, spread across the globe. It taught that a cockpit must operate as a team, not a monarchy. Every voice mattered. Every concern had to be spoken. Flight 052 had shown the cost of silence. The world vowed never to pay that price again. But even as reforms reshaped the skies, the emotional toll endured. One winter evening, nearly 5 years after the crash, a man named John Delaney stood at the edge of the Cove Neck Memorial. He had been one of the first firefighters on the scene that night. The memory still burned in his mind, the smell of jet fuel and snow, the cries in the dark, the image of a small child's shoe half buried in the mud. "I used to think I could forget," he said softly to a reporter. "But you don't forget something like that. You just learn to live with it." He paused, glancing up at the faint light of a jet crossing the night sky. "I just hope they know we tried. We really tried." His words echoed what many rescuers felt, that despite their courage, they had arrived too late to save most. Meanwhile, Avianca Airlines underwent its own transformation. The company, facing lawsuits and public outrage, nearly went bankrupt. But instead of folding, they restructured completely. They modernized their fleet, overhauled training, and became one of the first Latin American carriers to adopt full bilingual cockpit communication programs. By the end of the decade, their slogan changed from "We connect worlds" to "We understand the world." Quietly, those who remembered 052 knew what that meant. Even in New York, the families of victims found unexpected allies. The local community of Cove Neck, many of whom had risked their lives during the rescue, held yearly candlelight vigils. Survivors and locals came together, bound by a night none of them could erase. During one vigil, Sophia spoke again, now older, her voice steadier. "People ask me if I'm angry," she said. "I used to be. But anger fades. What stays is the lesson. You can't assume you're being understood. Not in life, not in love, not in the air. You have to speak until someone hears you." Her words, recorded by a local journalist, went viral years later, turning into one of the most quoted lines in aviation seminars worldwide. But beneath all the progress, one mystery still lingered, something the official reports never fully explained. Why hadn't the crew declared an emergency even in the final seconds, when it was clear they were falling? Some experts believed it was pride. Others thought it was shock, disbelief, the human mind's refusal to accept the inevitable. But one theory stood apart, whispered among pilots, that Captain Cavides simply didn't want to die believing he'd failed. To declare Mayday was to admit defeat, and in that moment, perhaps denial felt kinder than surrender. It wasn't cowardice, it was heartbreak. The wreckage of Avianca Flight 052 was eventually removed, piece by piece, leaving behind an empty clearing that nature reclaimed with quiet mercy. Trees grew again, grass covered the scars, and the birds returned. Yet every January, as the wind swept through the branches, the locals swore they could still hear faint echoes, a rush of air, a distant engine hum, a voice calling, "Kennedy, we're low on fuel." And though time moved on, that voice remained, forever circling, forever reminding the world that sometimes, tragedy doesn't come from the sky, it comes from silence between two people trying to understand each other. The crash had rewritten history, reshaped language, and rebuilt systems, but at its core, it remained what it always was, a story of human fragility. And in the end, that was the greatest truth of Flight 052, not that machines fail, but that hearts and voices, when lost in translation, can fall just as fast. In the years that followed, the story of Avianca Flight 052 became something larger than a tragedy. It became a mirror, forcing humanity to confront how fragile understanding can be when lives hang in the balance. The world had moved forward technologically. Flight systems had grown smarter, communication became automated, and new safety measures emerged to prevent fuel exhaustion from ever claiming another life. Yet, even amid this progress, the ghosts of that night refused to fade. For those who had survived, every improvement in aviation safety came at the heavy cost of remembering what it felt like to fall through darkness with nothing but hope to cling to. In Colombia, the crash remained a wound that never fully healed. Families still gathered every January, their candles flickering in the humid night, their prayers rising toward a sky they once trusted. They spoke their loved ones' names one by one, and though decades had passed, the pain lingered, because to them, Flight 052 wasn't history. It was a scar carved into the heavens themselves. Sofia Alvarez, once a frightened passenger trembling in the wreckage, had by now become an advocate for international aviation reform. Her work took her from Bogotá to Washington, to Geneva, and finally to New York, the city that had once been her nightmare. She stood in front of countless pilots, controllers, and trainees, telling her story with quiet strength. When communication breaks, she would say softly, "Machines don't save you. Humanity does." Her words carried the weight of experience, the kind that no textbook could teach. One evening, during a lecture at the International Air Safety Symposium, she was approached by a young pilot who looked at her with awe. "You were on Flight 052?" he asked hesitantly. She nodded. "I read about it in training. They made us study it. They said it's why we have new phraseology rules now." "You saved lives." Sophia smiled faintly. "No," she said. "They saved themselves. We just finally learned to listen." Back in the United States, a new generation of investigators and safety experts continued to reference the case. In one NTSB training session, a senior instructor played the cockpit recording once again, the same haunting audio that had shaken the world decades ago. "Listen to the voices," he told his trainees. "Do you hear panic?" They shook their heads. "Do you hear desperation?" Again, silence. "That's the problem," he continued. "They were dying, but they didn't sound like it. That's why we train differently now. The human voice is not always honest about fear." Those words struck every listener deeply, especially those who had never lived through a real emergency. It reminded them that beneath every checklist, every system, there is a fragile human heart trying to stay calm while the world collapses around it. Meanwhile, in Cove Neck, the small patch of Long Island where Flight 052 fell, time had softened the landscape but not the memories. Locals had long since rebuilt the homes damaged by the crash, the trees had regrown, and wildflowers covered the soil where fire once burned. But even decades later, residents still recalled that night vividly, the flash of fire in the storm, the trembling ground, and the cries in the darkness. Each year, survivors and families returned for the memorial ceremony, standing beneath the trees with quiet reverence. The memorial stone had weathered with age, but the engraved words, "Out of fuel, not out of courage," remained sharp and clear. On one such anniversary, Sophia returned again, standing among a small group of mourners. Snow drifted gently around her, settling on the white roses in her hands. She had brought her son this time, a boy of 12 with curious eyes and a restless energy. As the ceremony ended, he looked up at her and asked, "Mom, were you scared?" She smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I was," she admitted. "But what scared me most wasn't dying. It was knowing no one understood us." The boy looked confused. "What do you mean?" She knelt to his level. "Sometimes people can speak to each other and still not really hear what the other means. That's what happened up there in the sky. And that's why we have to listen carefully, to everyone, everywhere." He nodded quietly, perhaps not fully understanding, but sensing that her words were sacred. Later that evening, Sophia stood by the frozen shoreline near the memorial and watched a plane cross the night sky, its lights blinking steadily. It was quiet, peaceful routine. Yet every flash of light brought back memories: the dim cabin, the silent fall, the unbearable stillness before impact. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not for herself, but for every pilot, every controller, every passenger who would ever step into the sky again. She prayed that they would never know what silence sounds like when hope runs out. In Bogota, Captain Cavid's widow lived a quiet life away from the public eye. She had spent years defending her husband's name, fighting to remind the world that he wasn't negligent, that he had done everything he could with the information he had. One evening, a journalist found her at her home surrounded by old photographs and faded newspaper clippings. "Do you ever wish he'd done something differently?" he asked. She looked at the picture of her husband in uniform, standing proudly beside his Boeing 707, and shook her head. "He did what he believed was right. He trusted people to hear him. That was his mistake, but also his faith. He believed in others until the very end." She looked out the window toward the setting sun and added, "He wasn't wrong to believe. The world just wasn't ready to listen." Even in aviation schools decades later, students learned about him, not as a cautionary tale of incompetence, but as a reminder of the importance of clarity, humility, and courage. Pilots began adopting a phrase inspired by him, scribbling it on notepads or posting it near their simulators. "Say it like lives depend on it, because they do." And in every control tower, that lesson took root. Controllers learned to listen between words, to hear hesitation, fatigue, or distress even when it wasn't explicitly stated. The sky itself had become more aware, more human. But for those who lived through it, healing never meant forgetting. A decade after the crash, a documentary titled The Last Hold, the story of Avianca 052, premiered on television. It featured survivors, rescuers, and air traffic controllers reflecting on that night. One of the most powerful moments came when Michael Reeves, the controller who had handled the flight that night, finally spoke publicly. His face was older, weary, but his voice carried the same quiet weight of guilt. "I replay it in my head all the time," he said. "I hear his voice saying, 'We're running out of fuel,' and I think, why didn't I ask? Why didn't I know? I was supposed to listen. That was my job." Tears welled in his eyes as he added, "I wish I could talk to him now. I wish I could tell him I'm sorry." The screen faded to black on that moment, and millions watching felt a collective ache. It wasn't about blame anymore. It was about the realization that tragedy is rarely born from malice. It's born from being human. As the decades rolled forward, air travel became safer than ever before. Each flight that crossed the Atlantic carried in its design, in its training, in its communication, a piece of what Flight 052 had taught the world. Pilots declared fuel emergencies without hesitation now, controllers double-checked intentions, airlines prioritized rest and cultural understanding. The world had learned, but learning never erased loss. In a strange, bittersweet way, the passengers and crew of that doomed Boeing 707 had given the gift of safety to countless others who would never know their names. On the 30th anniversary of the crash, Sophia stood again at the memorial, older now, her hair touched with gray. The cold wind brushed against her face as she placed her hand on the engraved stone. Reporters had gathered nearby, cameras rolling, but she ignored them. She simply whispered, "You're not forgotten." As the sun dipped below the horizon, a plane passed overhead, its engines humming steadily, its navigation lights cutting through the evening haze. Sophia looked up and smiled faintly. "You made the skies safer," she murmured. "That's your legacy." And for a brief moment, as the roar faded into the distance, she could almost hear a familiar voice carried by the wind, a calm, steady voice saying, "Flaps full, the gear down, hold on." And she did. Because to remember was to hold on, to courage, to truth, to the fragile humanity that holds every aircraft aloft. Flight 052 was gone, but its echo still lived in every takeoff, every landing, every word spoken clearly between sky and earth. It had fallen, but its message would never fall again. The night sky over Long Island was calm again. No storms, no flashing radar echoes, no holding patterns full of tired voices circling unseen above the Atlantic. Just peace. And yet, for those who remembered the night of Avianca Flight 052, that peace would always carry a certain silence, a silence heavy with memory. 3 decades had passed since that Boeing 707 fell from the sky, but the story still echoed through every classroom, every control tower, and every pilot's heart. The names of the crew had become more than statistics in a report. They had become symbols of what it means to be human in a world built on precision and steel. It was strange how something so small, a missed word, a tone misunderstood, a single minute of hesitation, could change history forever. But that was the truth of 052, that the sky remembers everything. The final investigation report had long since been archived, its pages yellowed with time, its conclusions familiar to anyone who studied flight safety. But behind the official language, fuel exhaustion due to failure to declare an emergency, lay something far more profound, a story of trust, exhaustion, and faith. The captain, Laureano Cavides, had trusted the system to understand him. The first officer, Mauricio Klotz, had trusted that politeness could coexist with urgency. The controller, Michael Reeves, had trusted his training to tell him when a pilot was in trouble. Each of them had been right in their own way, and yet together, those truths had collided into one fatal misunderstanding. In the years that followed, each of their lives, or their memories, had been weighed and reinterpreted by journalists, experts, and storytellers. But for those who had truly listened to the final tape, it was never about blame. It was about the realization that in the endless conversation between earth and sky, humanity's greatest strength and weakness had always been the same: the human voice. By the time the 30th anniversary arrived, both nations, Colombia and the United States, had come together to hold a joint remembrance. For the first time, representatives from the FAA and Avianca stood side by side at the memorial in Cove Neck. The ceremony was quiet, simple, dignified. The trees surrounding the site had grown tall again, their branches forming a green cathedral over the clearing where twisted metal once lay. Candles flickered in the cold January wind. Families of victims stood beside pilots in crisp uniforms, air traffic controllers, and even students who hadn't been born when it happened. They listened as Sofia Alvarez, now in her 50s, stepped up to the microphone. Her voice was steady but carried the kind of emotion that could only come from survival. 30 years ago, she began softly, I sat in a seat near the back of a plane that never reached its destination. I remember the laughter before the turbulence, the soft light in the cabin, the calm in the captain's voice. None of us knew we were running out of time. I thought we were landing. I thought we were safe. But then everything stopped. No sound, no engines, just silence and darkness. Her voice trembled, then steadied again. That silence changed me. It changed all of us. It reminded me that safety isn't just about machines or metal or rules. It's about people. It's about listening. If someone says they need help, we have to hear them. Not just the words, but the meaning behind them. Because sometimes, one word can save 100 lives. As her words faded, the crowd remained silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then a young controller from JFK, standing near the back, whispered to the colleague beside him, That's why we always ask now. If they say low fuel, we ask, Are you declaring? That's because of them. And in that simple statement lay the legacy of everyone lost. After the ceremony, Sophia walked away from the crowd, down the narrow path that led to the edge of the bay. The winter air bit at her skin, but she didn't mind. She stood there for a long time, watching the faint outline of a plane passing high above, its lights blinking rhythmically against the twilight sky. Somewhere far beyond that horizon, someone was flying home safely, unaware that their uneventful journey owed itself to a tragedy that had once shaken the world. You made the skies safer, she whispered again, a line she had spoken before but would never stop repeating. Elsewhere, in a quiet coastal town in Florida, Michael Reeves, the controller who had handled Flight 052 that night, lived in quiet retirement. He no longer worked the radar screens, but he still woke up some nights to the sound of static in his dreams, the echo of a voice saying, "We're running out of fuel." He had lived for years with that sentence in his head, replaying it, wishing he'd understood, wishing he had asked just one more question. But over time, he learned to live with the guilt, transforming it into purpose. He became an instructor for young controllers, teaching them not just to follow procedures but to hear emotion in tone, hesitation in silence. When his students asked him why he was so strict about communication drills, he would simply say, "Because sometimes the only thing between you and disaster is one misunderstood word." Few of them knew his history, but they felt the weight in his tone, the kind of wisdom that can only come from loss. In Bogota, the Cavides family had aged quietly, the captain's widow now an elderly woman surrounded by photographs and letters from strangers. Every year, pilots and aviation students sent her notes of gratitude, telling her that they had learned from her husband's story, that because of him they were safer, more careful, more human. She kept each letter neatly stacked in a wooden box, labeled La Leçon, the lesson. On the anniversary morning, she placed a single white flower beside her husband's photograph and whispered, "They remember you." The world's attention had long since moved on, consumed by newer headlines and fresher tragedies. But in the aviation community, Flight 052 remained eternal. It was still taught in classrooms, still simulated in training sessions, still cited in manuals as the defining case of miscommunication and fatigue. And each time a young pilot declared Mayday without hesitation, or a controller double-checked a vague transmission, the spirit of those lost lived on in that brief, clear moment of understanding. On the 40th anniversary, a major airline commissioned a special documentary titled, When Words Failed, The Legacy of Avianca Flight 052. It featured new interviews with survivors, families, rescuers, and experts. Near the end, the film showed Sophia returning once more to Cove Neck. The camera lingered on her face as she looked out over the memorial, her expression calm, almost peaceful. The narrator's voice came softly over the image. In every flight that lands safely, in every conversation between sky and ground that ends in understanding, a part of Flight 052 flies again. The screen faded to black, leaving only the sound of an aircraft's engines fading into the distance, not the roar of panic, but the steady hum of something alive, something enduring. In the final years of her life, Sophia wrote a book, part memoir, part reflection, titled Silence at 10,000 Feet. It was not about the crash itself, but about what it meant to survive it. In one of the final chapters, she wrote, "The human voice is the most powerful instrument ever built. It can command a machine, save a life, or bring comfort in chaos. But it can also destroy when not heard, when lost in the noise. Flight 052 taught me that survival is not about strength or luck. It's about being understood." The book became a quiet bestseller among pilots and travelers alike. Some said they never boarded a plane the same way again. On her final visit to the memorial, years later, she came alone. The forest was silent except for the faint rustle of wind through the trees. She ran her fingers over the names engraved in stone, tracing each letter as though she were reading them aloud for the last time. Then she closed her eyes and whispered, "We didn't die in vain." Above her, a distant rumble of engines rolled across the horizon. For a moment, the sound almost resembled a heartbeat, steady, human, alive. And perhaps, somewhere in that vast open sky, the souls of those who perished that night still flew together, free from miscommunication, free from fear, forever understood. Because in the end, that was the legacy of Avianca Flight 052. Not a story of failure, but of connection, fragile, flawed, and profoundly human. It reminded the world that even in the face of disaster, humanity always finds a way to learn, to listen, and to rise again. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel for more true cinematic air disaster stories that honor courage, memory, and the lessons written in the skies. Until next time, fly safe and never take silence for granted.